Hey all, okay, so Doctor Sleep. First off, welcome to another impromptu episode of Film Recommendations. This is going to be kind of an off the cuff one, as has been the habit of late. Anyway, Doctor Sleep is the recent reincarnation, if you will, of the roughly 1980 film The Shining. And when I say reincarnation, I mean that in the truest sense because it takes a lot of elements from the Stanley Kubrick version of The Shining, which was the first version that I remember seeing, um, and really takes a lot of what you love, but does not, and this is the important factor, does not just borrow from nostalgia. In a previous video, I had discussed that, oh, this might be more of a nostalgia trip for some people, kind of like they did with It, where they made that kind of like, oh, look, it's the 80s for the kids, right? And even in some of the flashbacks, they did do that nostalgia thing a little bit with the kids in It. But I'm pleased to say that for all of the amount of stylistic things and scenes and settings and elements, this really is a very good homage, if you will, but at the same time continues the story. So you end up feeling really satisfied by what you get from the result. Um, I'll clarify a little bit. So they say that this was based on the novel by Stephen King, and just off the top of my head, I want to say that King allowed this because he's been having a really good string of luck with, some of his films, some of his stories being produced into new adaptations. Um, Not like back in the 80s and 90s when he was kind of a hot ticket item, but more like he's established, he knows that he's on his way out, and there are a million authors willing to take his place. So if they make some really good film versions of his stories, it'll reinvigorate the books, but also establish a certain sense of permanence because he'll be in multiple media. Um, Let me just say first off that I actually am one of the few people who really likes both versions of The Shining that were produced. There was a less beloved, but still nevertheless really good one with Rebecca De Mornay and Steven Weber, more famous for being the goofball brother on Wings. In a real break for him, he played Jack Torrance. And Rebecca De Mornay, I think I'm remembering the right actress, played uh, the wife and mother, whose name I'm blanking on, because, you know, the original Jack Torrance, Jack Nicholson, was so memorable in that role. Anyway, that one had um, a lot more borrowed from the book, a lot more intrigue around the history of the hotel, a lot more elements built into it around everything that was happening and how the nature of the place worked, uh, where it was left more mysterious in the Kubrick version as to what was happening. I like to say in a lot of my discussions about The Shining that it was kind of as if you were going through the experience yourself, kind of like a haunted house ride. You see something, you're not sure if it's happening or not. So much of the experience of the Kubrick version of The Shining is kind of dreamlike, where you get flashes of things and you can't account for them being there. You know, 1 second Danny sees the ghost twins, and they cut quickly to the scene of the two little girls having been murdered and their blood everywhere. Horrible, really horrific, but at the same time very trippy, very eerie, leaves you unsettled for that period. Just as soon as you feel like everything's normal, your your guard is down, and that's when um, we get the wonderful scenes with all of the different ghosts around the hotel. So, with that being said, uh, the 1993 version, I think it was, it was a bit later in the decade, um, in the period, because I know that it came out in 1990, and then you had uh, ones like the Langoliers and the Tommyknockers produced, and those were interesting. But the reimagining of The Shining was really sensational for me. Um, it introduced so many different aspects to storytelling. It was really mobbed down not mobbed down, bogged down more so in Stephen King storytelling. Later, I had a chance to see some other Stephen King stories, like of course we've pretty much all seen Shawshank Redemption, but one of my personal favorites is a wonderful coincidence. One of my favorite directors, David Cronenberg, directed the Stephen King adaptation of the story The Dead Zone, which borrows a lot when you get into it. It goes into a lot the from the same kind of world of The Shining, if you will. There's that presence of psychic abilities, that ability to um, see beyond, that extrasensory perception, in essence. Uh, but at the same time, it challenges the viewer because so much of the setting is mundane. So much of what you're seeing in the Dead Zone is just people interacting in a scene. There's not much to it aside from a little editing here and there. And I think, to cut to Doctor Sleep, that is my favorite aspect of the storytelling elements in Doctor Sleep. You could have it be a special effects bonanza like you did with it, where the monster is suddenly there and has all the teeth and is just looking horrific, and there's lots of spectacle. Or you can go a more subtle route where so much of it is much more, shall we say, in the subtext. So I'll give you an example. At one point, there are three characters that you really need to focus on for the story, and they're the three that the director has us focus on for the story. One is Rose, who wears a kind of black top hat that's somewhat short. And she's our villain. Our villain literally wears a top hat in this film. Anyway, um, then of course you have Danny, and then you have the new character of young Abra, who's about 13 years old uh, when the main action of the story takes place. Much like the writing of the Dead Zone, the initial parts of the story actually take place years prior, and it gives you a good sense of things. One aspect that I found interesting but not distracting was the fact that they recast so many actors to play parts previously, incarnated by other actors, and it is almost seamless. I say almost because you can tell that they're different people. It's not hard at all. But they aren't doing impersonations. The mother isn't doing Shelley Duvall. They do have someone playing Jack Torrance as a ghost, and he does not do a Jack Nicholson impression. He does Jack Torrance, but just by this other actor who happens to look enough like Jack Nicholson in that role. They chose another actor to play young Danny and put him in the appropriate clothing, gave him the right hairstyle and everything. It's when I say it's seamless, it really is just about there. And of course, they have a different actor playing Scatman Carruthers' uh, character, but at the same time, it really is almost seamless. The character portrayals are right there along the same lines as if you never skipped a beat with these folks. With that said, um, the premise of the story, because I know you're really interested in that. Um, if you haven't seen this film already, we'll get to whether or not you should see it. But in a nutshell, the premise is that Rose leads a roaming band of basically vampires, um, except instead of being like, blood sucking vampires, they're basically psychics who feed off of other people's psychic energy. So, much like the ghosts at the Overlook Hotel fed on Danny like a battery, giving them a little bit more energy to live again. Uh, these are similarly psychics, but they have lived for centuries. One of the fun bits of casting that I do have to point out is that they got the Swedish actor whose name I'm blanking on, who played Mr. Holm in Star Trek The Next Generation and later reprised his role in Deep Space Nine. And uh, he also played Lurch in uh, the two Addams Family movies with Raul Julia and Angelica Houston and Christina Ricci and. Uh, so that was an amazing uh, thing to see him in that because I think he passed. I I might be mistaken, but I think he passed, and I think that may have been his last role. But uh, he was just a beautiful bit of casting because they kind of needed someone older, and they didn't have him do anything physical. But basically, Rose leads this group who travel, and they travel unescorted. But part of the reason is that this what they call steam, which is basically um, energy, like ether, I think would be a more common parlance term, um, essentially escapes from especially psychic people when they're in pain. So this group doesn't just, steal energy from people. It actually tortures and mutilates and murders them before they finally kill whoever it is and just suck up whatever's there. But when Grandpa Flick, who is the particular guy played by the actor who played Mr. Home, when he dies, they feed on his energy too. They just gobble him up, so they eat their own. That's how bestial and monstrous these particular folks are. Um, we're shown how they bring others into their fold. So they decide because they find a 15-year-old psychic who is what they call a pusher. In essence, she can force you to do or think or say whatever. And what she does is she goes um, after uh, male pedophiles and plants suggestions in their minds and leaves a mark on their cheek as a way of just, you know, destroying them, basically. And it's like a snake bite. It's almost like in uh, Batman v Superman, the mark of the bat on people. Anyway, it's more of a thing of vengeance. We find out later that she really does just hate men, that this is just her whole thing. She's really kind of a two-note character, unfortunately, but she willingly joins this group who at first I thought were maybe a cult, um, maybe they were um, living on the land at the time of the incident with the Torrances, and the ghosts took them over or something like that. But nothing so creative. They're just vampires. We find out also that Danny is still haunted, even though he has moved far, far away from anything and everything. They, you find out later that they actually moved to Florida because they never wanted to see snow again. And if you were staying in the Overlook Hotel over the winter, you probably would never want to see snow again either. With that said, um, Danny is still haunted by the ghosts. They particularly show the bathtub ghost, who, if memory serves, was like just a beautiful starlet or just a woman. And every season she stayed at the Overlook Hotel and she never wanted to leave, but every winter she had to leave. And then one year, just as winter was approaching, I guess she offed herself in the bathtub or she just died from old age and illness. I don't know exactly. But here's the thing. It it the ghost of Scatman Crothers' character, who I am absolutely blanking on what his name was, even though they mentioned it. My brain. Anyway, so the cook from the Overlook, who was Danny's friend and talked to him about shining, uh, he comes to him and says, "Look, you get to know this box, get to know all about it, learn every dimension about it, because you're going to build one just like this in your mind. And when those ghosts come back to try and get you, you just lock them up in that." And later we find out that, oh yeah, he's actually had several encounters with these ghosts over several years, and he's had to put them in this box. We find out that Danny essentially never got over the trauma, which this is really good at portraying trauma. That it does take time, and sometimes you turn to substances, or sometimes you have a hard time getting your life together after experiencing a certain amount of trauma. It works, okay? We find him as a drifter. He uh, he is drinking all the time. Um, he ends up in Maine. I don't know why Maine, but he just ends up in Maine. And one of the locals in this small town takes pity on him and, tries to help him find some work, get his life together, takes him to AA meetings. He gets on board with Alcoholics Anonymous and he stays sober. For years, this happens. It works, you know. Uh, just he gets his life together. I'm not saying AA works. I'm saying it works in this story. So anyway, Abra is what they call a looker. Um, there are different categories, of course. Uh, anyway, and Abra is an incredibly strong psychic. Um, the actress is really good. Um, she doesn't seem like it at first, but she's really dialing it down in terms of her acting ability. She was well directed and well coached. I have to really give her that. Um, and that's not saying that she's not a good actress. That's saying that she worked well with the people who were there to kind of help her do better. Um, and the scene that I want to talk about with regards to her acting ability and the simplicity of editing. Um, at one point, Abra is taken by one of these vampires and is in the back of the van. And they play the tropes up all the way here, folks. It's a windowless van. Uh, they pull up along the side of the road and offer to give kids a ride and everything. They are quintessentially evil, and it is just beautiful how ridiculous some of it is. But anyway, at one point, this they do some of the simplest tricks. It's a set on a soundstage. We know that. You can tell that just by the way it's all gonna, the way it's all playing out, the different camera angles they use. They're in a van, but it's a set. But what they do is they cut from the girl and the kidnapper being alone in the van to Danny being in the van with her, but Danny is only there in her mind. It's a psychic projection. That is so simple a technique to use. You don't have him fade in. He's just suddenly there. And this is after we see him sitting alone in his room and closing his eyes, and his head shakes a bit, and they play a little noise over it, some Foleys. They play some sound effects over it, and then cut to him in the van after he zeroes in on her voice, her mind calling out, saying, "Uncle Danny, come find me." And then she sits up, and here's the cool part. Her demeanor changes to be a bit more like Ewan McGregor's acting, his version of Danny Torrance, the adult Danny Torrance. Confident, um, somewhat wry smile a little bit. It works. But the trick that they do, they change her eye color. They don't change it to, excuse me, I am so sorry. Anyway, they don't change it to like blank white like they do in some of the other scenes where they're like tapping into their powers. They change it to Ewan McGregor's eye color. It's so subtle. And there are some less subtle things in the rest of the film. At one point, Danny is in this one guy's office, the AA leader. He's in his office telling him, after telling him about, like how he could read the guy's mind and everything. And the office is a dead ringer for the exact same office for the manager at the Overlook. That's not coincidental. It's meant to be like, you know, making you remember The Shining. I don't exactly see a reason to make that office identical, though. You understand? Like, they're having a conversation and the demeanor is roughly the same, but it doesn't fit. Now, mind you, I saw the director's cut, so when I'm talking about this, it might not be in the in the film, because that whole element of, oh, I read your mind, I know where you left this one important thing that you need for your job, you left it in the bathroom on the soap dish, and then cut to the office. It doesn't go anywhere plot wise. It doesn't need to be in the film. As best I can tell, all it does is explain how and why there's an entire subplot around Danny comforting the dying. And that's where he gets the name Dr. Sleep, because he says to some of these dying patients in a nursing home, you know, when you die, it's just going into the best sleep of your life, and then, you know, uh, this world seems like a dream, and they just make up some stuff for all intents and purposes. But it's interesting, it's poetic, it drives the story, it compels you to want to find out, okay, what's going to happen next? Um, my absolute favorite part of the story is when Um, Abra and Danny both, in their own ways, go on the attack and try to trap the vampiric psychics. Um, I immediately thought when these people said that they lived a lot longer than usual, my immediate thought was, wait a minute. If you guys have lived, because they have Mr. Home dying, and as he's going, they've talked about how he witnessed, the Colosseum fights in ancient Rome, and he's fed on princes and kings, and he sailed to the New World, and all this. So my immediate thought was, okay, so if you guys know you're gonna live a long time, why wouldn't you put a bunch of money in the bank and then have that just to live on? If you're gonna live a long time, you struggle for a while, and then you build up some capital after uh, about 50 years, and just keep that stuff rolling along. Yeah, but anyway, so then they later find out or reveal that, yeah, these guys are rich, they're powerful, they live like, you know, in a caravan, like a caravan of hippies, but with a surprising amount of wealth and infinite gas money, apparently. And I was like, how are they affording all of this? How are they affording a Winnebago with a hot tub and all this other stuff? How are they buying food? Because they still have to eat. And it turns out, yeah, they have like contacts in the NSA because they're like, they've basically been able to live so long that they've been able to affect things uh, in a sub rosa kind of way. With that said, it's something you just have to kind of accept. You suspend your disbelief for a minute because you're already believing in psychic powers and ghosts for the purposes of the story. But as it is, um, I'm not going to tell you how it ends because I don't like doing that. I do like. I know that if I tell you the ending, it won't ruin it for you because it's all about the journey. But I'm just trying to give you a review, not a complete reveal of everything that happens in the story. But there is a twist at the end, but it's satisfying. It's not a bad twist, it's not an upsetting twist, it's not a terribly predictable one. As it is, I feel like the entire treatment for the story was very easily written. They were like, "Oh, well, yeah, Danny's on the skids, but he meets this young girl who's more powerful even than he is, but there are these psychic vampires who come and try and feed off of them, and they have to go to the Overlook and have this final confrontation." Oh my goodness, excuse me. Have this final confrontation, and then yeah, it 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 when you extrapolate and look at it from just what it was written as, probably as a treatment, it can be a bit hokey. But in terms of the journey, in terms of the little steps along the way, in terms of the different characters interacting, including at this final showdown, which does take place at the Overlook, that's not ruining a thing for you. Um, it's a satisfying ending. Fans of both the book, fans of the 90s version, and um, fans of the late 70s, early 80s version will all really like this. Um, I won't say it has a lot of replay value, but certain scenes are really satisfying, and I think you'll get a lot out of them. As it is, it's not a bad movie. I'm not going to give it a low rating. Um, we'll give it a 4 out of 5. It's strong, it's compelling. I'm not going to watch it again and again because it is a 3-hour long slog when you get to the director's cut. I think it was only slightly less long in the theaters, which is one of the reasons why you didn't hear a lot of people talking and raving about Doctor Sleep. But I think if you're a really big fan of The Shining, or if you want to have like a really great Halloween, spooky movie night, you could do worse than watching The Shining and Doctor Sleep back to back because I think you'll have a lot of fun. They play well off of each other. Doctor Sleep does a lot to take um, from the Kubrick Shining, and it works. It falls together decently as a story. It's fun, and I think you should definitely check it out. Uh, I'm not saying it's perfect for everyone. It definitely has some scares. It managed to only have one jump scare noise that I can recall in the entire film. And yeah, it just is a relatively solid, well put together little bit of storytelling, and I think you'll have a lot of fun if you give it a try. It it doesn't affect me as much because I grew up in a 100-year-old home that had really long corridors with no windows. So I grew up in like the scariest house to live in ever, and so for me, the you know I grew up in a place like that, so I don't feel as scared by that stuff. Um, Not since I was little anyway. But as it is, you grow up with that kind of thing. Eventually, you get a little bit desensitized to it. But as it is, this one it feels like a winner. It feels like a good solid piece of film. I think you'll get a lot out of it. It definitely is a good one for like a midnight or late night kind of watching, um, just to get like the goosebumps going. Uh, as it is, definitely check it out. And if you want to, please click like, click subscribe. I'd love it if you did. Um, Ding the bell, do whatever. And I would love it if you would donate to my Patreon campaign or follow me on social media. Either way, hopefully I can give you plenty of updates for any future videos. I am sorry that I'm having to do this in the long stream of consciousness, off the cuff kind of stuff, but uh, I have tried to keep it relatively concise so that you're not getting bogged down in my waning brain capacity. As it is, like I said, if you want to leave a constructive and respectful comment below, I always appreciate that. And take care. Bye.